15 years, I ended up as the only historian among librarians teaching archival science to librarians, which was, I really felt like an odd person for a long time, because there are very different ways of thinking about organizing these kinds of library materials versus archival materials. I won't go into it, but I began to really understand how important history was in terms of building, interpreting, appraising, just all aspects of archival work, but could not be effective, could not be as effective if it were not for history. So one of the things that I did was to convince the school to create a dual degree program in history and library science for the training of archivists to really try to push that forward. So I say that because I've spent a lot of time advising people on how to become an archivist or what to think about if you want to go into this kind of work. And I thought maybe that would be the most useful thing for me to just dwell on for a few minutes. I think the most important thing for you right away is to understand the archive world, is to step back and understand that there are public archives and private archives, and they're very different. And the requirements for people working in those fields are somewhat different. Some of the problems here in academic institutions, the requirements are somewhat different. They tend to be more looking for people with a library-like degree or library-like inclinations in the work that they do. There's a part of the work where you're focusing on collecting personal papers, and a lot of that takes place within special collections, and I think it's important to understand what special collections are and where you might fit into that work, versus those archives that are more true archives collecting the records of organizations or institutions, and what that means and how that actually affects the work that you're doing and who you meet with on a daily basis. As an institutional archivist, when I spend most of my time people I spend most of my time working with are administrators at the institution whose records we're trying to collect as part of private history. But when we work with the faculty and we're trying to bring in their personal papers, it's more the manuscript side of my hand, dealing with people who have their own personal materials that they want to donate. It's a very different experience having that kind of conversation with a collection versus an administrator who is not as connected with those materials. The more you can get out there, I think, talk to people in the field, understand these differences, the better equipped you're going to be to informational interviews. The better equipped I think you're going to be to really figure out which part of this world you might want to find yourself in. The field has really changed dramatically since I've been doing this for 30 years, and the field has just changed dramatically. I didn't have a computer on my desktop as an archivist when I first started, and now it's my entire life. So I think my original thought was that I'd be out there having some basements, some of the places to do, maybe not the sewer, but close to it, dumpsters. I've been in a dumpster. To the point now where almost all of my time is consumed with trying to figure out what to do with the electronic legacy that we're right now. It's a collection of a different sort. It really is as intellectually challenging, if not more so, than collecting the materials and other formats. It's as important, and frankly, it's so much more fleeting than the other materials. And the pressure to do this kind of work and to keep a history piece there, and as part of what inspires you to figure out how to deal with these problems is I don't know what I should probably stop, but I would just say that the work itself, it's about history, but I think, if you end up working in public archives like the National Archives or state archives, it's also about government accountability. It's about people's rights. It's the kind of research that I did in an academic environment tends to be scholars writing books, administrators trying to find out past policies, and students who are sometimes having their first experience. But if I were to talk to my colleague who work with you, it might be a little different of architects and other people coming in and trying to get a sense of where building plans are and how that will affect that wisdom. The work is different, but yet is very important in terms of, I would just say,
because I was kind of wedged in give us a different perspective. As I look around the audience and know a little bit about the people on the panel, I think I'm the oldest person in the room. That's not reassuring in some ways. But some of the things I'm going to say, I'm going to speak with perspective, professional perspective. 35 years ago, I was a graduate student laboring on my dissertation. I had a pretty good CV, 2 years of full-time teaching, 3 years as a teaching assistant, lots of experience as an adjunct, as probably some of you have. I had given several papers. I'd entered graduate school with the expectation that I would complete the necessary coursework, write a brilliant dissertation, spend the next 40 or so years as a history professor, working on my tenure, teaching bright and alert students, publishing reviews, articles, and a few influential books along the way. Unfortunately, the market for new history PhDs had changed dramatically from the time I entered graduate school. How much did it change? Well, let me tell you. I started out with a master's degree. I got a master's degree in 1969 at the University of Arkansas. People came looking for me to teach. This was a golden period. This is when schools were expanding dramatically. As a matter of fact, my first job I was walking down the hall, and the chairman came and said, "I got a guy on the phone, can you talk to him?" He said, "A position at a four-year job." I got other unsolicited offers to teach. And then I thought, well, this is great. Why don't I go back to school and get a PhD and really nail this down? Well, between the time that I went back to the PhD and the time that I was on the job market, probably not much different than some. Things changed dramatically. When I had been 23 years old with a master's degree and embarrassing little any experience, and I was available. After I had experience, was ABD, very difficult. Things had totally changed. In some ways, that 5 or 6 year period was the best of times and the worst of times. Well, I thought they were the worst of times until I started looking at the statistics for what's happening today. I looked at AHA statistics, I reviewed things in the Chronicle of Higher Education. And what I found is things are worse now than in those dark days that I thought were as bad as it could get. Not only are there, as other people have noted, too many PhDs in the school market. The situation appears, if you look at it over the last decade, to be getting worse, not better. Let's go back to that period 35 years ago, when, as I said, I was in the same stage in my career as an I was very fortunate. The chairman of the history department at the university was also the co-editor of the papers of Andrew Johnson. And he invited me to apply for a research position. My first instinct, fueled by desperation, was to accept it. It was on campus, in the library. I knew other people who worked on the project, and it paid pretty well. I thought also, this is temporary. And when the real job comes along, then I just ease out of it. I was there 4 years. And what I found, surprisingly enough, in documentary editing, I really liked it. And it was quite rewarding, even though I was on the lowest rung. I parlayed this into a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of South Carolina, a one-year appointment. I I left there 22 years ago. The head of the project that I had began with as a fellow. I have been the editor-in-chief at the Adams Papers, 3 blocks down the street, Massachusetts Historical Society, for over 8 years. I have never looked back. I have taught some along the way, what teaching is. It isn't as rewarding as the way I looked at it when I was 20 years old. I almost completed my graduate school education being totally unaware that there was such a thing as documentary editing. So I didn't consciously prepare for that career. What I know, though, in my case, your case, is that your years of research, critical thinking as a graduate student in history, you have been prepared for this kind of work, even though you may not be aware that it exists. For those of you who are at this point in your career and have narrowly focused on a certain type of job, a certain type of career, a specific path, let me assure you there are other things out there. And let me tell you a couple of things about documentary editing. What do documentary editors do? Very, very simply, we take correspondence, other documents produced by individuals, in the case of the Adams Papers, families, institutions, or documents from a certain period, and provide reliable texts, we like to say authoritative texts, for scholars to use in their research. There's a great deal of research involved, especially in deciding what you're going to publish and in the annotation that you present. This is a relatively new profession. It really boomed in the 1960s, but the earliest of the modern editions of the Jefferson Papers, which you can trace back to the Adams Papers began in the 50s. Most are print editions. There are a few born digital editions, Dolly Madison at the University of Virginia, for example. However, most editions, even if they're 50 years old like the Adams Papers, now have a digital component. Almost all of the projects are located at universities. Jefferson Papers are at Princeton, Franklin Papers are at Yale, the Washington Papers, the Madison Papers are at UVA, the Margaret Sanger Papers are at NYU, the Stanton Anthony Papers are at Rutgers, but there are projects all over the country. There are also editors, documentary editors working for the federal government. A few states have them, and in situations like myself, there are some documentary editors working for historical societies. Most of the projects are small, but there are some large ones. The ones that I mentioned are large. The Adams Papers, I would say most of the projects, the major projects, have from 5 to 10 editors. Some have a couple of dozen. Joseph Smith Papers in Salt Lake City is a huge project. You might have 2 editors. The Adams Papers, we currently have 14 people. 8 are full-time, what I consider full-time work. We have 1 fellow, and some part-time. In some ways, I like to think that we're like a little history department. We have people with PhDs from all over the country, all over the world. In fact, we have one woman who has a PhD from Melbourne in Australia. Michigan State, Wisconsin, Tennessee, South Carolina. We also have a person from William & Mary, a person with a law degree from Tulane. very, at least educationally wise, very better. Salaries are very competitive with comparable university salaries. The Founding Fathers Papers Incorporated does a salary survey every year or two, and when I looked at the statistics for history faculty throughout the United States, editors of the major projects are paid as well or better than their peers. Competition for jobs is, I would say, keen, but not nearly as competitive as for academic positions. To give you an example, since I have been at the Adams Papers, I look back, I've hired 11 people, most at state. Recently, 2 years ago, I posted a professional position, one that required at least ABD, would like to, I did. I had 20 good applications. I think that's quite low. If you've been out in the market, in the academic market, if you could get into a competition where there were only 20 applications, you might feel it. Some of the additions at universities demand PhD. You have to have PhD. For example, the Jefferson Papers will not retain anybody who has a PhD. When I look for a person, when I review applications, what I'm looking for, first of all, is research skill, good research skills. It doesn't have to be in eastern Massachusetts in 1785. That would be great, but it doesn't have to be. For example, the woman from the University of Melbourne, her research specialty is mining in the 19th century. Far afield from anything that the Adams and wherever. But she's a crackerjack researcher. Documentary editing has a professional organization, the Association for Documentary Editing. It's an annual meeting. Meeting in 2011 in Salt Lake City, hosted by Joseph Smith Papers. The work is very challenging. Much research and writing, a great deal of organization. Just as some of the other people have said or indicated, at a certain point in your career, if you stick with it long enough, you become more of an administrator than a researcher. It's the same as if you become the chairman of the history department. You move up. One of the things that I say, usually not to academic historians, but I'll say it anyway, our work, the volumes that we produce, have a longer shelf life than most of the monographs that are produced by historians. When you produce a crackerjack work that meets all of the requirements and answers all the questions that are being answered at that time, and another generation becomes a curiosity. Not so with the documentary editions. They go on and have last. Now, there is a downside. It isn't as rosy as I might like to think. So I tried to think of those things that would, give you pros and your cons. I gave you a few pros. Here's the cons. There's almost no chance of tenure. You work 12-month schedule rather than an academic schedule. Also, you maintain regular hours. It isn't, professors who put up office hours Monday from 1 to 2, and then have 1 or 2 classes in the middle season. We have to be in an office working, because one of the things, and also this is one of the other negatives, is that we have to work on soft money most of the time. We work on federal grants, grants from foundations. And so we have to constantly reapply. And if you say, oh, I'm working on that, it doesn't flow. You have to continue to produce. So consequently, there's a requirement to get the work done in a timely fashion. And then the other thing, from my point of view, you and from other editors that I've talked to. You will always be condescended to by academic historians, whether they're employed or not. I have found, however, that the positive aspects of the work greatly outweigh the negatives, and I encourage you to take a broader view of how to employ your